Welcome back to Passionate Oral Talk Radio. Educate, enlighten, entertain. Also, cool your heels with Lillian Caldwell. Heard every Tuesday evening from 8 to 9 p.m. on AMFM247.com. And this afternoon, our special guest is from the U.S. Naval Research. His name is Mike Frum, and he's going to be talking about the new phenomenon that's brought about by fire and heat. Good afternoon, Mike. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Lillian. Thanks for having me on.
Well, there's so much going on now with the fires in Australia and what it's doing with the new fire and heat problems, and we also have experience with the California fires. I thought it'd be good for my audience to understand what is going on. So could you please explain this new phenomenon?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me just say that it is a new phenomenon to the lay public, I believe, but the phenomenon itself that we'll be talking about is something we've been researching at the Naval Research Lab here in Washington, D.C. for 20 years now. And we made a discovery back in the late 90s and early 2000s of particles in the stratosphere that we couldn't understand. And most people would have said it came from a volcano. And what we found out, to make a long story short, is that these were smoke particles from forest fires that had been injected into the stratosphere by this process that now people are hearing about called the pyrocumulonimbus storm. We call it pyro-CB for short. And so it's like a fire-generated thunderstorm. It is a fire-generated thunderstorm that has special qualities that make it, in some ways, like a small volcanic eruption.
So is it like when the atmosphere soaks up from water from lakes and oceans and gets it all mingled up and then comes back down and as rain or snow? Is that what's going on?
Well, no, it's a little bit different in this case because what is being sucked up is anything and everything that's generated by the fire and the intense heat of the fire. So think about it like a very hot bubble of air coming off the fire with all of the smoke and other material, including water vapor, but that goes straight up into the atmosphere, creates this thunderstorm cloud, and then what we find is that that cloud itself, where a normal thunderstorm would rain stuff out and put it back down on the earth, the pyro thunderstorm does not give much precipitation, if any at all. So you get a direct, efficient injection of all that stuff that is in the fire smoke right up to the top of the cloud. And that top of the cloud is also particularly high because the thunderstorm itself is particularly vigorous and energetic.
So is that what is starting a lot of the fires then in Australia, is that it's collecting all this stuff, putting it up in the atmosphere, and then when it has this thunderstorm activity, it sort of reignites everything down below it?
Yes, that's a good point and well characterized. There is that concern that these storms have a certain feedback of sorts. Once it's started, it excites the fire because it's so windy and chaotic. The fire itself gets more intense and generates even more of that thermal bubble to re-energize that pyro-CB cloud. And in the case of the Australian storms, for example, what we have observed from space here at NRL is several bubbles or pulses of these pyro-CB injections into the stratosphere. One fire might generate 4 or 5 different pulses that would be like 4 or 5 different mini volcanic eruptions. And then what's left afterwards is a plume of smoke and gases from the fire in the upper atmosphere.
So how dangerous is this for any one nation to have to fight?
It's extremely dangerous. And in fact, I'm not a firefighter, nor am I a firefighting expert. But with our collaborations with the firefighting community, we know that these conditions are ones that you need to avoid at all costs. You cannot fight these fires. They are too unpredictable, they are too violent, and they are almost impossible to even see, to know what it is that's in front of you. So all the wise advice is, when these conditions are expected, and certainly when they started to occur, evacuation and pulling back and letting Mother Nature take her course is the proper prescription.
Now, I know that, for example, they had on the news last night that here in Pennsylvania that they were burning places, fields, grass, and everything. So in preparation for when the forest fires came, that these burned areas would either slow it down or maybe stop it. Would these kind of preparations help for when thunderstorm, all fire, and heat attack?
They could, and I know that that is a strategy. I can't speak to whether or if that was done in Australia. I wouldn't be surprised. It is a strategy that is employed. They call it a fire break. They'll actually burn or cut down a fuel line wide enough that they expect that if the fire were to advance in that area, it wouldn't have any more fuel to burn. So that fire break can actually stop fires. In the case of the pyro-CBs, though, I believe that the energy of the storm probably would outdo any fire break, because what happens is when these storms are going, they of course create lightning strikes, and they can themselves ignite new fires well beyond the fire break. They also do what they call spotting, where hot flaming embers are actually shot out of the cloud and blow with the wind, and they come back to Earth. They do come back to Earth, and they might light two fires. We know for a fact that that has happened in the past, and that can happen several miles away from the fire itself. So people are vulnerable miles from the fire front itself when it comes to these intense storms.
Now, is there certain conditions within the climate itself that creates this fire and heat phenomena?
The conditions, the answer is yes. The conditions can be summarized as we do with hot, dry, and windy. So if you have high temperatures, if you have very low relative humidity, and you have a lot of wind, that's the prescription for these fire conditions. So if you have those conditions and you don't even have a fire, you are at risk. Once a spark is lit, then you can get a fire that's out of control very quickly. For instance, in Australia, in their Black Saturday event, 2009, they had similarly intense pyro-CBs with a lot of damage and even fatalities as a result. Some of those fires that created all that damage and destruction didn't even exist on the morning of Black Saturday. They were started by winds blowing down power lines, starting a fire, and then it raced out of control, too much for anyone to control. And then they went into these severe storms in a matter of a few hours.
It almost seems like that storms like that would also be with a tornado, because I lived in Texas, and it become very hot and it's very dry over there most of the time. And of course, the wind would pick up, the sky would turn yellow, and the next thing you know, the tornado would come ripping down the highway.
Yes, you make a good point, and there are some similarities, and in fact, that's something else we're studying here at NRL, is just that. We do know, and we've actually published a paper with evidence from another Australian pyro-CB of a genuine tornado that was spawned by and did damage during a pyro-CB in Canberra in 2003. You mentioned Texas. We observed a pyro-CB in the panhandle of Texas in 2018 near Lubbock, and that was unusual. We didn't normally see a pyro-CB, but those conditions you described did exist, and they happened to have a wind-driven fire that intensified into one of these pyro storms, and then it also generated the kind of supercell thunderstorm that people look to for tornadic events. I'm not sure one turned out in that case, but most of what you just described is something we observed in Texas a few years ago.
Well, it would not surprise me. Now, I do know that they do drop some kind of chemical formula on fire to help contain it, or to at least wipe some of it out. Would that also be used in handling these pyro fires that appear in Australia?
I do know that chemical formula is used. I don't know much about it. I'm not an expert to tell you when they use it and when they might not use it. I do know that in general, in the past few weeks in Australia, they've been aggressively treating those fires with retardants from the air, and whether they are helpful in the case of the extreme firestorms, I don't know.
I was just curious because I know that, again, in California, when they have the El Nino come in and that whips up the shoreline and then goes in, and they have hot, dry climate over there. They've been experiencing, I guess, droughts of some kind, that the conditions there would be similar to what happens over in Australia.
They are similar, yes, and I'm sure your listeners know that many fires recently in California have made headlines for some of their deadly intensity, and some of them don't turn into pyro-CBs, but they still are in those conditions that are hot, dry, and windy, and are equally unpredictable and dangerous.
Do you feel from what you studied that because of climate change and that the weather is changing, that there's more of a chance of these pyro fires starting in the United States?
I'm not comfortable predicting the future.
Okay, I didn't mean it to be predicting the future. I was just curious whether we were just setting ourselves up to have more of these type of fires prevalent than before.
Well, there are many factors to increase our risk to fire, including just living close to where fires exist. I mentioned to you that we started this research 20 years ago, and one of the first things I learned is just how natural fire is in the environment. And what is not natural, or perhaps newer, is that we encroach on that wildland environment more and more, and so we put ourselves in a position to observe them and be vulnerable to them when they occurred long before, and we didn't even know because we didn't live there.
Yeah, I was just wondering. Mike, could you please tell everybody where they can find the U.S. Navy Research Organization on the World Wide Web, and any additional information you feel like they need to know in order to come and learn some things?
Certainly. The Naval Research Laboratory is in Washington, D.C., and if you were just to go to www.nrl.navy.mil, that's our public website. And they do have valuable information there. Our resources include our plant in Washington, D.C., a location in Mississippi, Stennis, Mississippi, and also in Monterey, California.
Terrific. Well, Mike, I want to thank you very much for taking time to come on and explain about fire and heat, because other people have noticed what's going on in Australia, and a lot of them are concerned that maybe that type of situation may happen in the U.S. across the Great Plains. So I really appreciate you taking the time. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll be able to hear this program all over again at https://passionateworldtalkradio.com. Scroll on to the right-hand side of the menu, and you will see Cool Your Hills. Click on that, and it will take you immediately to the page. You can also hear it on iHeart. You can hear it on Spotify, Podcaster, Podchaser, iTunes, iHeart, and all of social media. Before you go away and stray, Lichtenberg had this to say in 1764: as soon as I have asserted a proposition, where can more examples be found? So take heart. Thank you all very much for listening, and remember, please keep listening. Thank you.